Aruba Central has a Managed Service Provider or MSP mode, which enables the management of multiple isolated tenant accounts from a single MSP account. But how can we manage each tenant via the API? In this video, I'll show you how. Let's get into it. Hello, this is Joe Neville and welcome to Aruba Central API Getting Started Part 2. And in this one, we're going to focus on Managed Service Provider. Here's a quick recap then. The Aruba Central API uses an OAuth 2 framework for authorization, which separates user accounts from applications. The users grant authorization to the applications, and it's the applications that access the API. The user delegates to the application. If you need more information about this, link on the screen to the first video now. But for the rest of us, let's take a closer look at Managed Service Provider. MSP mode is a multi-tenant operational mode where the MSP admin can provision multiple tenant accounts and then allocate devices and sites and groups to them. So the MSP account sits as kind of like a parent and the tenants are like the children of that parent. And the MSP admins from the parent account can drill down into specific tenant accounts and perform admin tasks and configuration, etc., just like a standard central account. When you're in a tenant, you can only see what's assigned to a tenant. The tenants are kept separate. Here's a graphical representation of an MSP and multiple tenants then. So we have the MSP account and we create tenant A and then assign sites and devices to tenant A. And we have other tenants like tenant B and tenant C, and they respectively have their sites and devices assigned to them, and the tenants cannot see each other, so tenant A cannot see information about tenant B, but the MSP account can see A, B, and C. But what does MSP mean for authorization with the OAuth 2 framework? What if we want to interact programmatically with the MSP account and their respective tenant accounts? Let's take a closer look. Now, if you recall, the kind of story arc of any programmatic workflow when interacting with an OAuth 2 framework is for the user to authenticate an application, then the application gains authorization, it gets an auth code, which it exchanges for an access token and a refresh token. And then with the access token, it can include that in the header of its subsequent API calls to get at that sensitive data. The first video was entirely focused on a single token workflow. Now, the thing is, in MSP mode, the token workflows are entity specific, and by entity, that's just a name that I'm giving to an MSP account or a tenant account. So when the user authorizes an app, which can then run through the authorization workflow, that workflow receives a token which can query an MSP account or a specific tenant. The workflows do not result in some kind of all-seeing token that can query the MSP account and the various tenants. The tokens are specific to the MSP or a specific tenant. Let's jump over to Central and I'll show you an example of this. Here I am on my Central account, which I've converted to an MSP type account, and I've created two customers, blue and red. Now, in my device inventory, I have 6 switches. I'm just going to focus on switches, but this is valid for access points and gateways. We're just going to focus on switches for this demo. I have 6 switches in my inventory, and I've assigned 3 of them to different customers. So blue's got 1 and red's got the other 2. Don't worry that everything's down, this is just a demo account. Now, if I go over to Swagger and I do a query on the device inventory, I've taken this token, which I have produced in the standard approach at the global level, so that's going to be at the MSP account level. If we do a get for the inventory devices, and I've used the SKU type of switches, if I try that, what you see, and here's the response, you'll see that we've got 3 switches, and what these are the unassigned switches. So these are the ones that are not against the customers, these are still against the MSP account. Because this is an MSP account access token, I can only see the devices that are at the MSP account level, not the ones that are assigned to the customers. And to prove that, let's go back to the dashboard and I will go to the unassigned switches and I will assign them to these customers. And I can do that by just hitting the unassigned number here. That takes us to the device inventory. I'll select all three and assign to customer. Okay, now those are all assigned to blue. We'll hop back over to Swagger, run the call again. Remember, it's an MSP token, so if I try this, what do we see? We're querying at the MSP level. We don't see anything because all of the devices are assigned to the different tenant accounts. As we can see, the various workflows cannot cross the MSP tenant boundary. And that means we need to maintain an MSP workflow as well as per tenant workflows. Which you could say, well, that seems like a major hassle. But actually, if you're interacting programmatically, you can solve this with code. And what happens is the user authenticates and grants authorization to an MSP created app, so at the MSP level, and the parent MSP workflow is like a vanilla workflow to obtain the standard access and refresh tokens, which we've already seen in video 1. But then the parent MSP workflow can be used to interrogate the API, and this is the new stuff. Via the API, we can get per tenant client credentials, and with those client credentials, we can initialize per tenant workflows. So we can roll from one MSP level workflow into a tenant workflow. That begs the question then, how do we obtain the client credentials? Well, we have to make a post call to a new URL. Well, it's new to this getting started guide. This is the new stuff. So it's a client underscore credentials URL, which sits underneath authorize, and we use the client ID of our MSP account. So that's just the vanilla client ID. We do that call with the CSRF and session token that we would have received from the initial authorization of the MSP workflow. And in the JSON body, this is where we start to diverge from the standard vanilla workflow. We have to include the customer ID of the tenant, okay? And then applying this to the demo that I showed in the first video, the MSP level client ID is the one that we wrote down and put into our variables. So we've already got that one. The CSRF and the session token, that comes from the MSP workflow login call. Now, the tenant ID, so where do we get that from? Do we get that manually? Well, you don't have to. You can actually get that programmatically. So this is where we start to see the power of automation. So it's not actually that much of a hassle to interact with the API in MSP mode and interrogate the various tenants that you have. We can do all of this programmatically. And how do we do that? Well, all of the tenant customer ID, so that information that we need for this client credentials call, that's exposed via an API. So we have a specific MSP underscore API, and we can get the customer details from there. And what we can do is we can use our MSP level token to interrogate that API and get that data. But hold up, I'll come clean here, because that new API call under the MSP underscore API customers, that needs the customer name in JSON to return the correct tenant ID. Okay, so there's additional information that we need there to make that call. So the old rules might be that we query the GUI and we record down all of our tenant customer names, and then we put those into our API calls. You know, point and click with our mouse to obtain the data, and then we can go on programmatically. But that's the old rules. Here's where the fun begins. Okay, so with the new rules, what we can do is we can actually make an API call to the MSP underscore V1 customers and then get the customer names from that API. We can get all of the customer names, put them into a list, and then use a for loop to obtain the tenant IDs. Okay, so that may seem a little confusing. It makes sense to me because I've been living this for the last couple of weeks. But the overarching theme of all of this is that once you have your MSP workflow token, you can get all of the information that you need for this via the API. You don't need to go into the GUI to grab any information, record anything down. You can interact to grab all of the data via the API. You just need to fire off that parent MSP workflow to get your access token. And then there's a host of MSP specific APIs that you can use to get that information about your tenants. Here's where we go into the details. First of all, let's have a look at that parent MSP workflow, which is a vanilla workflow. So we'll go through this quickly. This is essentially just a recap then. So it's the OAuth 2 framework that we've already seen in video 1. The user does the login request, authenticates the application. We do the login call to the authorization server. We have a session cookie response, which has got that vital CSRF and session token. We record that, do an authorization request. The details in that call, the customer ID and the client ID, that's all the standard MSP level account. We get an authorization grant with an authorization code, and then we return that with our client ID and our client secret, again, MSP level, okay? Nothing to do with the tenants at this stage. This is just the MSP workflow. And then we get the token grant, which is for the access token and refresh token for the MSP. And now things get interesting as we diverge and go into the tenant workflow. We can use the MSP access token to make the API calls for the tenant names and the tenant IDs from the MSP _API v1 customers API. That will return our customer names and IDs that we need to make the next call. And that is to the all-important client credentials API. Now we're using the MSP level information, so the access token, the CSRF, the session, the MSP client ID, but we are including the tenant customer ID. And that's the tenant that we want to start a new authorization workflow to receive a tenant-specific access token and refresh token. In the client credentials API call response, we get the tenant client ID and the tenant client secret. And then at this point in the standard vanilla workflow, this is where we would perform the authorization request. So this is what it would look like in a non-MSP workflow. So CRSF token, session token, customer ID and client ID going off to authorize central API. This is what it looks like with the MSP edition. We make the authorization request with the CSRF and the session, but it's the tenant customer ID and the tenant client ID that we're using at this stage. Then we get the authorization response, which is an authorization code for tenant A, and we use that to make the authorization code grant request to OAuth 2 /token. And these are all tenant specific pieces of data. So it's the client ID, the client secret, and the customer ID, all of the tenant. So this, you see, we've diverged from the MSP to the tenant. We're now doing the authorization specifically for the tenant. And then if all is successful, we receive back the token grant of the access token and the refresh token for the tenant. And then at that point, we need to save off the refresh token for our MSP and for our tenant. And we'll need to run through that authorization workflow to receive refresh tokens and access tokens for all of the tenants that we want to query in our workflow. And now we can make API calls into the tenant. So in this case, into tenant A using the tenant A specific access token. And get back that tenant specific data. Okay, that was the full authentication and authorization workflow then. What if we want to run this for a second time when we've got a refresh token? What does that look like in an MSP environment? Well, by contrast, in a non-MSP environment, we would make a refresh token call with a grant type refresh _token using the client ID and the client secret, receive back the token grant, so a new access token and a new refresh token. Then we use that new access token to make our API call. Then in the MSP setup, we send the tenant A specific information and refresh token. So it's the tenant client ID, the tenant client secret, we receive back a token grant, which is an access token, a refresh token for the tenant. I'm sure you're spotting the pattern by now. And then we use that tenant-specific access token to make our API calls. So it is a fact that multiple workflows must be maintained. We've got to have the refresh tokens, the access tokens, etc., because we need to authorize for each one of the tenants. But if you handle these programmatically, you can let the code do all of the heavy lifting for you. So your interactions and your workflows look very similar if you're in a non-MSP mode versus an MSP mode. Okay, so that's enough of the theory. At this stage in the video, so we can move on to a Python workflow. This one's a little bit different because this is the MSP edition. Here I am on Visual Studio Code. So the code that I'm going to show is an adapted version of the central class Python code that I showed in video 1. I've added in those extra steps that I mentioned to get the customers, get the tenant IDs, those all-important client credentials, and then flow from a vanilla workflow, which will become the MSP level workflow, into the tenants. So let's dive in and have a look. There's quite a lot here, so I'll just focus on some of the main points. This class central client is the vanilla workflow. The important points are we've got the login there, we've got the authorize, and this is where we get the token. So this is what I use at the MSP level. And that class works alongside another class. This is the MSP client. This is the tenant workflow. This is a bit more complicated. The principles are essentially the same. The conditionals in there are to just pick up different eventualities of tokens. But the important points are that I have a method here to get the customer details, so the customer and the tenant ID, then the client credentials, and then we flow into the authorize and the calls to get the access and the refresh tokens. Taking a closer look at the client credentials, here you can see I've got a specific method for client credentials, and there's that URL that I am querying. We've got the various headers, parameters, and the call there. But as mentioned, there's a lot here, so I won't go into too much detail because that would be a very long video. Essentially, if I scroll down to the bottom, what I am going to do is the MSP is instantiated as a central client, so that's the MSP workflow, and then that will flow into a workflow which essentially goes right across my MSP account. It goes into the MSP, it picks up the different customers that I've got against this account, it raises the authorization and the tokens for each one of the customers, and then it does some tenant specific API calls to pick up details from within the tenants and consolidate them. One of the issues being, remember that if you do a get call, it's just specific to the MSP or it's specific to a tenant. But if you combine all of these, you use the power of automation and programmability, you can string all of these workflows together and then get a consolidated view of all of the tenants in one go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the details to screen. So it's not going to be too much. I've only got 3 switches. I've reverted the customers, so red and blue customer that I showed earlier. I reverted those back to the 3 switch assignments. So we've got 2 switches against red, 1 against blue, but I hope you can see, in principle, what you can do with automation against the central account when using the MSP mode. Here I am on the Ubuntu client command line that I'm going to run my code on. One of the finer details that I haven't mentioned is that because now we're going to get multiple refresh tokens, so 1 at the MSP level and 1 for each one of the tenants, I've created a directory where I'm going to store them. If I do an ls on that at the moment, you can see that it's empty. We're going to go for a full authentication workflow to start with. So just to recap, what that's going to do is that's going to authenticate at the MSP level, run through and pick up the access token and the refresh token for the MSP. Then we're going to do a query against the customers that are assigned to this MSP account, so that's red and blue, and then roll into the authorization workflows per tenant, pick up the refresh token and the access token for each one of the tenants, and then I thought I would do a simple get call. So I'm going to get some device inventory information for the tenant assigned devices, and I'm going to consolidate that into a table and print that to screen. Okay, so all I have to do is run this Python MSP. I'm running it in a virtual environment, so it's just Python msp.py. It really doesn't look like much when I run it. There's a lot going on in the background, but that's really the power of automation, isn't it? Okay, so no refresh token found at the MSP level. We have to do the authentication. We're getting information about the tenants. I've just put some messages to screen so that you can see where we are. Writing the blue refresh token, so that's for the blue tenant. And then for the red tenant, we've got the refresh token is being written. And then all of the device information should be printed to screen, and there it is. So we've got the different customer listed, we've got the names of the tenant devices, MAC address. But I just picked out, you get a lot more information from the device inventory. I just picked some out that would make a nice table that I thought would be quite useful. So we've got the model, and then we've got the image that each one of the devices is running. Now, if we do an ls for tokens, if I can spell that correctly, there we are. So now that folder is populated, and the MSP refresh token, I've called it main, and then these are all written automatically. So because of the customer name, that has been written in there as a variable. Okay, so the obvious next step then is to see if our refresh workflows work. So this should be quicker. I will up arrow, run that again. Refresh token is found. So we don't have to do the full workflows. We're also seeing the refresh tokens for each one of the customers as well. So it's not a full authentication authorization workflow. It's just the refresh token workflow in each case. And we write to screen again. Okay, well that was Aruba Central API Getting Started Part 2, where we looked at how to interact programmatically with an Aruba Central account that had been set up for the MSP mode. There was a lot there. I hope you found that useful. Please do like, comment and subscribe. You know the drill by now, I'm sure. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for watching. My name is Joe Neville, and goodbye.